Over the past year, I've tried my best to learn as much as I can about Philippine history and Philippine politics. I've tried to read as many books as my brain can process at one time. But while doing so, I've realized that there are many complications in Philippine history that I didn't know before I started. So this video is meant to help elucidate some of this, to help for anyone who wants to read Philippine history in the future or is reading it right now, to help them be in a better starting place than I was by telling you some of the problems in Philippine history, so that when you start reading or when you make sense of what you're reading, it will be more informed, in a more balanced way. Because some of the stuff took me several months to learn, and some of them I'm still trying to learn and unlearn. So this is just for anyone who's curious about reading Philippine history, because I think, especially right now, it's very important for us to have a good sense of how our society has changed over time and how it can possibly change in the future. And the only way to do so is to see how things have been, or how they have been presented over time. I think that most people don't have the free time to do so because of many issues. I'll go to some of these issues soon, but I think it's an essential part of helping one make sense of things. So if anyone is, I'm sure some of you may be curious about wanting to learn more about Philippine history but don't know where to start, this video may be helpful for you. Number 1 and 2 I wrote here are quite similar. Number 1 is history is written by the victors, and number 2 is sometimes it's difficult to read through bias. So one of the things that is difficult to understand in the process of learning history is that how you know history was influenced by things that were very consciously constructed to make you know certain things and not others. Let me simplify that a little bit. Most of us learn history from school, and school is mandated by the government, and there are specific curriculums, there are specific textbooks that are allowed to be taught to students. And whatever we were taught is what we probably would at least have our initial beliefs based on. But if you think about it, different administrations have different, points of view on Philippine history. What the Department of Education teaches under the Duterte administration is probably different from the ones that were taught during the Noynoy Aquino administration, or the Marcos administration's Department of Education probably had different textbooks that were allowed or taught or had different content than what was taught during the Aquino administration. It seemed obvious that this would be so, but each one of us would have been brought up. We would have, whatever time period we happened to kind of learn history, and for me it was the Gloria Arroyo administration and some parts of the Noynoy Aquino administration. That would have influenced the rest of how we think about Philippine history going forward, unless we start questioning the things that we learn. Now, the difficulty is that when we read Philippine history books in school, it's not clear where some of the information comes from. It's not very clear what the bias of the authors are. And even if you start reading Philippine history books that are published more, publicly, sometimes it takes a little research to understand the situation in which that book was written. So depending on what book you're reading, depending on what period of history that book is written in, depending on the political views of the author, the story of Philippine history would have been different. There would be different main characters, there are different pivot points, there are different lessons to be learned, different points of view, for example, on who the real victors of the Philippine Revolution was, whether it's pro-Rizal or anti-Rizal, or pro-Bonifacio or pro-Aguinaldo. This stuff has been different over time, and different historians have different perspectives on this. And it's interesting because when you're learning history again, you don't have a sense of how it's been different over time, because you don't necessarily talk to every generation or every 6 years to talk about how they learn things differently and compare notes. People don't really normally do this. But when you read history books, you'll realize that things are presented in slightly different ways. So for example, one of the biggest differences is the Philippine Revolution. How it is described is very drastically different depending on who you're reading. Depending if it's Zaide or Agoncillo or Constantino, or someone more recent like Resil B. Mojares or Milagros Guerrero. There are many different ways to understand that period of time, where you can either be triumphant about the battles of the Filipinos against the Spaniards, or it can be but more defeatist, where it ends with the Americans kind of taking over and the Filipinos, revolutionaries, becoming adapting themselves into the American system and being thought of as like being traitors. So one way of looking Philippine history looks at the the members of the Philippine Revolution eventually becoming traitors, or you can look at it in a way where they were successful in defeating Spain and the Americans came and progress was created throughout the Philippines. And again, this is just one of the different ways that you can like look at the different you know look at one event and see how it can be interpreted in different ways, because some historians have different sources, and also even if they have the same sources, they can describe things in different ways, take different quotes out of context, or they can take quotes and interpret them in different ways. And this is not just for the Philippine Revolution, it's for so many parts of Philippine history, whether it's the period of American colonization, whether it's about the period of Spanish colonization, about the notion of Philippine independence, whether it's about Japanese occupation, whether it's about people power. Different authors have different biases, and this it's sometimes difficult to know what the biases are until you really read more about the authors, and you read more about what else they've said outside of the book. Maybe you can read interviews they've had, or you can read critics of them, and because every historian has a critic, there's a discourse behind every historian's point of view that is often invisible when you're reading the book itself. So you need to kind of search it out on your own, and it's all online. You can find papers all over criticizing certain perspectives. And I think this is not to say that you should not read books that are biased. I think it's important to do so with the awareness that it comes from a certain perspective, so that if you decide to read more history books about the same period of time, you'll have a better sense of the different ways it can be interpreted, and you perhaps won't tie yourself too much to strong lessons or strong political points when you're reading specific books. You kind of allow yourself to be a bit more disconnected and just see it more as information that you will process further when you see more sides of the same conflict. And this is very important, I think, and something that it takes a bit of practice, because sometimes when you read something, it can be very easy to be very adamantly excited about something because you think, well, wow, I've never read anything about this before, and I've never seen Philippine society in this specific perspective under this lens. But while it's okay to feel that way, it's also important to read what other people have said that criticizes that idea, so that you can at least have a more of a sense of knowing where to stand, whether it's being pro-Marcos or anti-Marcos, or having a more complicated view of Marcos, or same way with Cory Aquino or whoever else it is. It's important to have the critical sense when you're reading history, and again, learning about who the author is, when it was written, and what their political leanings are. Again, this is very important because it helps you, again, have a more rounded view of whatever it is you're reading. Number 3 I wrote here is most history books that have been written in the Philippines have not been republished. So, again, there are many perspectives that you can read about events in Philippine history, but unfortunately, so much of it is not republished. You can't access them. In other countries where they have a more robust publication culture, reading culture, whatever you want to describe it as, books that are most important in the history of that kind of field are constantly republished every few years. But in the Philippines, many of the most important Philippine history books you can never find, or you have to find second-hand copies of, third-hand copies of, and these are books that have been very, very influential for certain periods of time. So, for example, there just are so few books that are republished. There's maybe the first Filipino, the books of Leon Maria Guerrero, the translations of Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, along with the first Filipino are republished very often, and so are, say, Nico Joaquin's Culture and History and A Question of Heroes under Anvil. But if you want to read more of Nico Joaquin's other writings, you want to read, say, his writings on the Aquinos of Tarlac or something, or you want to read about whatever, like, not everything that is written by specific authors are republished, and most of them are not available online. So for me, for example, I personally have had to experience searching on Amazon, and trying to consider whether I'm willing to pay overpriced costs in order to learn specific topics, when education should be free for everyone, especially when some of these books are so important in understanding what it means to be Filipino and what it means to know Philippine history. And the reason why some of them are not republished is because one can argue maybe it's because of a lack of interest. That's possible. And another way is because maybe it's not the most convenient thing to kind of be proliferated during that period of time. Or maybe, I don't know, I don't want to speculate too much, but it's unfortunate because if they're not available to be publicly bought, at least to have, have them be available online, but most of them are not. And again, this is another difficulty of Philippine history, is that you want to learn something, but you have the barrier to entry is that the thing itself is just not published at all. It's not published anywhere. You can try to find scans online, but it's difficult. And even with me, I'm very lucky that I have the means to, go to bookstores and try to find these books and hunt them down in places like Popular Bookstore. But not everyone has that opportunity, and therefore not everyone will be able to engage in these very important documents that explore and engage with and criticize how we understand Philippine history. Because a lot of these books, I'm reading them and I'm just, my mouth is, I'm just aghast because I'm so surprised. Like, wow, I can't believe that this perspective has been brought out, but I've never heard it said before. And I realized, well, maybe it's because no one has read this book, or the ones who've read this book, are not too publicly talking about them. But it's a mystery to me. And it sucks because these are very important topics. Number 4, I wrote here on the, again, problems of studying Philippine history is that many of them are poorly written. Now, what I mean by this is that, maybe poorly written is a bit harsh, but many of our history books that, again, are number one, they're really very difficult to find. And sometimes when you find them, they're written in a way that is so inaccessible that it's quite frustrating. For me, I'm lucky that I have lots of free time and I can really focus in on them and try my best to unpack them, and I have been lucky to have been able to. But for a lot of them, you need to learn other things. A lot of them are they're written in this very academic language that that the average person would have a difficulty understanding, and I don't mean that as any way condescending. I mean it genuinely, because even I sometimes have a difficulty understanding them. But when you read them and they are written with such technical language and language that doesn't exist in normal day speak, that does only exist within the academic world, where for me to understand one concept, I have to read a whole other paper that describes the one concept, or so much of academic writing is like this, and unfortunately, a lot of our history writing is like this as well. So most of it isn't able to really go into the public sphere, because many people, even in the case where you have the money to buy these books, if you read them, you'd have to read other things, read papers that are not published anywhere. You have to find scans online. It's almost impossible for the majority, for 99% of people, to really read it. And when something is written in this kind of poorly written way that is difficult to understand, it's hard to be motivated to continuously read them and to finish them, because it's just a difficult thing. Most people are used to reading fiction, where a lot of what makes good fiction is the ease of readability, or at least having things be very aesthetically engaging consistently. Some of these books are so dry and academic, and it can make you lose interest. And as someone who's already doing my best to read some of these books, I've had some difficulty as well, and I admit that, because unfortunately some of these books are just quite hard to read, and I think hard to read in a way that they don't need to be. The most readable historian, I think Theodore Agoncillo is quite easy to read, although he uses lots of Marxist language that maybe you need to know before you start getting into him. And he has a very specific Marxist perspective that is not agreed on by everyone. Then you have maybe Rizal without the overcoat, Umberto Campo, who writes in a very accessible way, but other than that, it's really hard to find people. Patricia Abenales, I think, is quite accessible as well. And number 5 is there are so many perspectives, and it can all be very overwhelming. So if you kind of get through all of the hurdles of being aware of the different perspectives and different biases, aware that some of them are so hard to find, aware that a lot of them is very difficult to read, what you realize is there are just so many perspectives on Philippine history where you can keep reading them, and at the same time, it feels like it's hard to say what you actually know concretely, because now you're aware that there are so many other ways to perceive the same events that to some degree it requires having more faith, having more trust, having more of a sense of, you have to trust your own instincts, and you have to trust the field, that many pieces of writing have stood the test of time, and you have to trust that it's because they were respected and they have good history behind them. But a lot of the time, there are too many perspectives, and it really requires just trying your best to untangle things on your own in order to make sense of things. And I think, these are some of the first few problems, and maybe I can talk about some of the others in the future.